Report from the Interior, which we'll be talking about today, is his autobiography, paints a very vivid picture of his life and growing up in the 50s. He's been awarded the Prince of Asturias Prize for Literature, the Independent Spirit Award, and the Premio Napoli. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and also the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Let's give a warm Miami welcome to this native New Yorker, best-selling author, Mr. Paul Auster.
Actually, my parents weren't immigrants from Poland. They were both born here. It was their parents who came. A small detail, but it's actually relevant to what goes on in this book. So, sorry for the delay. We're trying something new. We're going to do a reading with photographs, because the photographs are part of the book, which is divided into 4 sections, and the first 3 are prose, but the last one is about 110 photographs which recapitulate the book, the first 3 parts of the book, in images. So I'm going to read snippets from the first part of Report from the Interior, which has the title, Report from the Interior. And these are not consecutive sections, it's jumping around, so bear with me. I think it'll be pretty coherent. In the beginning, everything was alive. The smallest objects were endowed with beating hearts, and even the clouds had names. Scissors could walk. Telephones and teapots were first cousins. Eyes and eyeglasses were brothers. The face of the clock was a human face. Each pea in your bowl had a different personality, and the grill on the front of your parents' car was a grinning mouth with many teeth. Pens were airships, coins were flying saucers, the branches of trees were arms, stones could think, and God was everywhere. There was no problem in believing that the man in the moon, it works, was an actual man. You could see his face looking down at you from the night sky, and without question, it was the face of a man. Little matter that this man had no body. He was still a man as far as you were concerned, and the possibility that there might be a contradiction in all this never once entered your thoughts. At the same time, it seemed perfectly credible that a cow could jump over the moon, and that a dish could run away with a spoon. Your earliest thoughts, remnants of how you lived inside yourself as a small boy. You can remember only some of it, isolated bits and pieces, brief flashes of recognition that surge up in you unexpectedly at random moments, brought on by the smell of something, or the touch of something, or the way the light falls on something in the here and now of adulthood. At least you think you can remember, you believe you remember, but perhaps you are not remembering at all, or remembering only a later remembrance of what you think you thought in that distant time, which is all but lost to you now. January 3rd, 2012, exactly 1 year to the day after you started composing your last book, your now finished winter journal. It was one thing to write about your body, to catalog the manifold knocks and pleasures experienced by your physical self. But exploring your mind as you remember it from childhood will no doubt be a more difficult task, perhaps an impossible one. Still, you feel compelled to give it a try. Not because you find yourself a rare or exceptional object of study, but precisely because you don't. Because you think of yourself as anyone, as everyone. The only proof you have that your memories are not entirely deceptive is the fact that you still occasionally fall into the old ways of thinking. Vestiges have lingered well into your 60s. The animism of early childhood has not been fully purged from your mind, and each summer, As you lie on your back in the grass, you look up at the drifting clouds and watch them turn into faces, into birds and animals, into states and countries and imaginary kingdoms. The grills of cars still make you think of teeth, and the corkscrew is still a dancing ballerina. In spite of the outward evidence, you are still who you were, even if you are no longer the same person. The world was, of course, flat. When someone tried to explain to you that the Earth was a sphere, a planet orbiting the sun with 8 other planets in something called the solar system, you couldn't grasp what the older boy was saying. If the Earth was round, then everyone below the equator would fall off, since it was inconceivable that a person could live his life upside down. The older boy tried to explain the concept of gravity to you, but that was beyond your grasp as well. You imagined millions of people plunging headlong through the darkness of an infinite, all-devouring night. If the Earth was indeed round, you said to yourself, then the only safe place to be was the North Pole. Stars, on the other hand, were inexplicable. Not holes in the sky, not candles, not electric lights, not anything that resembled what you knew. The immensity of the black air overhead, the vastness of the space that stood between you and those small luminosities was something that resisted all understanding. Benign and beautiful presences hovering in the night, there because they were there and for no other reason. The work of God's hand, yes, but what in the world had he been thinking? 6 years old, standing in your room one Saturday morning, having just dressed yourself and tied your shoes. Such a big boy now, such a capable boy, all ready for action, about to go downstairs and begin the day. As you stood there in the light of the early spring morning, you were engulfed by a feeling of happiness, an ecstatic, unbridled sense of well-being and joy. And an instant later you said to yourself, there's nothing better than being 6 years old. 6 is far and away the best age anyone can be. You remember thinking this as clearly as you remember what you did 3 seconds ago. It is still blazing inside you 59 years after that morning, undiminished in its clarity, as bright as any one of the thousands or millions or tens of millions of memories you have managed to retain. What had happened to cause such an overpowering feeling? Impossible to know. But you suspect it had something to do with the birth of self-consciousness, that thing that happens to children at around the age of 6, when the inner voice awakens and the ability to think a thought and tell yourself you are thinking that thought begins. Our lives enter a new dimension at that point, for that is the moment when we acquire the ability to tell our stories to ourselves, to begin the uninterrupted narrative that continues until the day we die. Until that morning, you just were. Now you knew that you were. You could think about being alive, and once you could do that, you could fully savor the fact of your own existence, which is to say, you could tell yourself how good it was to be alive. 1953, still 6 years old, some days or weeks after that transcendent illumination, another turning point in your inner progress, which happened to take place in a movie theater somewhere in New Jersey. You had been to the movies just 2 or 3 times before that, in each case an animated film for children. Pinocchio and Cinderella spring to mind, but films with real people in them had been available to you only on television, principally low-budget westerns from the 30s and 40s. Hopalong Cassidy, Gabby Hayes, Buster Crabbe, and Al Fuzzy St. John, clunky old shoot-em-ups in which the heroes wore white hats and the villains had black mustaches, all of which you thoroughly enjoyed and believed in with fervent conviction. Then, at some point during the year you turned 6, you were taken by someone to a film that was shown at night. no doubt your parents, although you have no memory of them being there. It was your first movie experience that was not a Saturday matinee, not a Disney cartoon, not an antique black and white Western, but a new film in color that had been made for grown-ups. You remember the immensity of the crowded theater, the spookiness of sitting in the dark when the lights went out, a feeling of anticipation and unease, as if you were both there and not there at the same time, no longer inside your body, in the way one disappears from oneself in the grip of a dream. The film was War of the Worlds, based on the novel by H.G. Wells, lauded at the time as a breakthrough work in the realm of special effects, more elaborate, more convincing, more advanced than any film that had come before it. So you have read in recent years, but you knew nothing about that in 1953. You were merely a 6-year-old boy watching a battalion of Martians invade the Earth. And with the largest of large screens looming before you, the colors felt more vivid than any colors you had seen before. So lustrous, so clear, so intense that your eyes ached. Stone-round metal spaceships landed out of the night sky. One by one, the lids of these flying machines would open, and slowly a Martian would emerge from within, a preternaturally tall, insect-like figure with stick arms and eerily long fingers. The Martian would fix his gaze on an Earthling, zero in on him with his grotesque, bulbous eyes, and an instant later there would be a flash of light. Seconds after that, the Earthling would be gone, obliterated, dematerialized, reduced to a shadow on the ground, and then the shadow would vanish as well, as if that person had never been there, and never even been alive. Oddly enough, you don't remember being scared. Transfixed is probably the word that best captures what was happening to you. A sense of awe, as if the spectacle had hypnotized you into a state of numbed rapture. Then something terrible happened, something far more terrible than the deaths or obliterations of the soldiers who tried to kill the Martians with their useless weapons. Perhaps these military men had been wrong to assume the invaders had come with hostile intentions. Perhaps the Martians were simply defending themselves as any other creatures would if they found themselves under attack. We were willing to grant them the benefit of the doubt in any case, for it seemed wrong to you that the humans should have allowed their fear of the unknown to turn so quickly into violence. Then came the man of peace. He was the father of the leading lady, the young and beautiful girlfriend or wife of the leading man. And this father was a pastor or minister of some kind, a man of God. And in a calm and soothing voice, he counseled those around him to approach the aliens with kindness and friendship, to come to them with the love of God in their hearts. To prove his point, the brave pastor father started walking toward one of the ships, holding up a Bible in one hand and a cross in the other, telling the Martians they had nothing to fear, that we of the earth wanted to live in harmony with everyone in the universe. His mouth was trembling with emotion. His eyes were lit up with the power of his faith. And then, as he came within a few feet of the ship, the lid opened. A stick-like Martian appeared, and before the pastor father could take another step, there was a flash of light, and the bearer of the holy word was turned into a shadow. Soon after that, not even a shadow, turned into nothing at all. God, the all-powerful one, had no power. In the face of evil, God was as helpless as the most helpless man, and those who believed in him were doomed. Such was the lesson you learned that night from War of the Worlds. It was a jolt you have never fully recovered from. The most celebrated figure from your part of the world was Thomas Edison, who had been dead for just 16 years when you were born. Edison's laboratory was in West Orange, not far from your house in adjacent South Orange, and because it had been turned into a museum after the inventor's death, a national landmark, you visited it several times on school trips when you were a child, reverently paying homage to the Wizard of Menlo Park, who was responsible for more than 1,000 inventions, including the incandescent light bulb, the phonograph, and the movies, which to your mind made Edison one of the most important men who had ever lived, the #1 scientist in human history. After a tour of the lab, visitors would be taken outside to a building called the Black Maria, a large tar paper shack that had been the first film studio in the world. And there, you and your classmates would watch a projection of The Great Train Robbery, the first feature film ever made. You felt that you had entered the innermost sanctum of genius, a holy shrine. Yes, Sherlock Holmes was your favorite thinker back then, a fearless exemplar of intellectual probity, the one who unveiled to you the miracle and the power of systematic, rational deduction. But Holmes was no more than a figure, an imaginary being who existed only in words, whereas Edison had been real, a flesh and blood man. And because his inventions had been created so close to where you lived, almost within shouting distance of your house, you felt a special connection to Edison, a singular intensity of admiration, if not whole hog, out-and-out worship. You read at least 2 biographies of your hero before you were 10, a landmark book first, then one of those orange books with the silhouette illustrations, saw television broadcasts of the 2 films that had been made about him, Young Tom Edison with Mickey Rooney, Edison the Man with Spencer Tracy, and for some reason, it strikes you as preposterous now, you imagined that there was something significant about the fact that both your birthday and Edison's birthday fell in early February, and, even more significant, that you had been born exactly 100 years after Edison, minus a week. But best of all, most important of all, the thing that solidified your bond with Edison to the point of profoundest kinship was the discovery that the man who cut your hair had once been Edison's personal barber. His name was Rocco, a short, not-so-young man who wielded his comb and scissors in a shop just beyond the edge of the Seton Hall College campus, which was only a few blocks from your house. This was the mid-50s, the late 50s, the era of the flat top and the crew cut, of white bucks and white socks and saddle shoes, of Keds sneakers and stiff jeans. And since you wore your hair short, in the same way nearly every other boy did at the time, visits to the barbershop were frequent, on average twice a month, which meant that every other week throughout your childhood, you sat in Rocco's chair, looking at a large reproduction of a portion of Edison that hung on the wall just to the left of the mirror, a picture with a handwritten note stuck into the lower right-hand corner of the frame that read, "To my friend Rocco, genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, Thomas A. Edison." Rocco was the link that tied you directly to Edison, for the hands that had once touched the inventor's head were now touching your head. And who is to say that the thoughts inside Edison's head had not traveled into Rocco's fingers? And because those fingers were now touching you, was it not reasonable to assume that some of those thoughts might now be sinking into your head? You didn't believe any of this, of course, but you liked to pretend you did. And each time you sat in Rocco's chair, you enjoyed playing this game of magical thought transference as if you, who were destined to invent nothing, who would demonstrate not the smallest aptitude for things mechanical in years to come, were the legitimate heir of Edison's mind. Then, to your astonishment, your father quietly informed you one day that he had worked in Edison's lab after graduating from high school, 1929, his first full-time job, one of the many young men who had toiled under the master at Menlo Park. Nothing more than that. Perhaps he was trying to spare your feelings by not telling you the rest of the story, but the mere fact that Edison had been a part of your family's history, which meant that he was now a part of your history as well, quickly trumped Rocco's fingers as the most important link to the great man. You were immensely proud of your father. Surely, this was the most vital piece of information he had ever shared with you, and you never tired of passing that information on to your friends. My father worked for Edison. Meaning, you would now suppose that your remote and uncommunicative father was no longer a complete cipher to you, that he was really someone, after all, a person who had made a contribution to the fundamental business of bettering the world. It wasn't until you were 14 that your father told you the second half of the story. The job of Edison had lasted only a few days, you now learned. Not because your father hadn't been doing well, but because Edison had found out he was Jewish. And since no Jews were allowed in the sacred precincts of Menlo Park, the old man summoned your father to his office and fired him on the spot. Your idol turned out to have been a rabid, hate-filled anti-Semite, a well-known fact that had not been included in any of the books you read about him. By contrast, there was the counselor at the day camp you attended during the summer when you were 5, a young man named Lenny, no more than 23 or 24 years old, much liked by all the boys in his charge, slight of build, funny, warm, strongly opposed to harsh discipline, who had recently come home to New Jersey after serving as a soldier in Korea. You knew that a war was being fought over there, but the details were entirely obscure to you. And as far as you can remember, Lenny never talked about his experiences in combat. It was your mother who told you about them. She, only 27 at the time, and therefore a contemporary of Lenny's. And one afternoon, when she came to fetch you, the two of them had a talk while you were gathering up your things. And when you and your mother were driving home in the car together, you could see how upset she was. More shaken than at any time you could remember, which surely accounts for why the incident has stayed with you all these years. She began telling you about frostbite, the intolerable cold of the Korean winters, and the inadequate boots worn by the American soldiers, the badly designed boots that could do nothing to protect the feet of the infantrymen, causing frostbite, which blackened the toes and often led to amputation. Lenny, she said, poor Lenny, had gone through all that. And now that your mother was explaining this to you, you realized that Lenny's hands had also suffered from the cold, for you had noticed there was something wrong with the top joints of his fingers, that they were harder and more wrinkled than normal adult fingers. And what you had assumed to be a genetic defect of some kind, you now understood was the result of war. Much as you had always liked him, Lenny now rose, in your estimation, to the rank of exalted person. For the most part, you were obedient and well-behaved. Aside from that spontaneous burst of altruism with your friend, you were by no means a saintly child, and you did not make a habit of giving away your belongings in selfless acts of commiseration. You strove to tell the truth at all times, but occasionally you lied to cover up your misdeeds. And if you did not cheat at games or steal from your friends, it wasn't because you struggled to be good so much as that you never found yourself tempted to do those things. Every now and then, however, in fact only twice that you can recollect with any precision, a perverse impulse would take hold of you, an urge to destroy and mutilate, to sabotage, to smash things to bits, and you would turn around and do something fundamentally out of character, at odds with the self you would come to recognize as your own. In the first instance, which occurred when you were around 5, you systematically dismantled the family radio, a large machine from the 1940s, packed with glass tubes and 6,000 wires, thinking at first that you would be able to put it back together, purposefully deceiving yourself by calling this exercise in vandalism a scientific experiment. But as you continued to extract the various parts from the innards of the machine, it soon became clear that rebuilding it was beyond your capacity as a scientist. And yet, in spite of that, you forged on, maniacally removing every bolted wire housed within the box, doing it for the simple reason that you knew you weren't supposed to be doing it, that behavior of this kind was absolutely forbidden. What possessed you to attack that old Philco, to eviscerate it and render it useless, to annihilate it? Were you angry at your parents? Were you striking back at them for some wrong you felt they had done to you? Or were you merely in one of those fractious, rebellious moods that sometimes get the better of small children? You have no idea, but you remember that you were soundly punished for what you did, even as you continued to protest your innocence, sticking to the story that your crime had been committed in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Even more mystifying to you is the episode of the tree, which occurred about a year after the radio rampage, which means you were approximately 6 at the time, and there you were alone again, grumpily wishing there was someone you could play with, out of sorts, restless, wandering around in the yard behind your house, when it suddenly occurred to you what a good idea it would be to chop down the little fruit tree that stood near the flower bed, the new tree, a poor, scrawny sapling, with a trunk so slender you could encircle it with your 2 hands. Such a small tree wouldn't pose much of a problem, you thought, and so you went into the garage to hunt for your father's axe, which turned out to be ancient, no doubt the oldest surviving axe in the Western Hemisphere, with a handle so long it was almost as tall as you were, and a blade so dull, so thick, and so rusted that it probably would have been hard-pressed to dent a stick of butter. On top of that, the axe was heavy. Not too heavy to carry into the backyard, perhaps, but once you were in front of the tree, heavy enough to make it difficult to lift above your head, and far too heavy to swing with any force. Not the baseball bat you had imagined it would be, but 7 bats, 20 bats, and therefore you had trouble keeping it parallel to the ground, couldn't orient it in a straight line because your wrists and arms were wobbling as you drove the dull blade into the tree, and after 6 or 7 whacks you were so exhausted that you had to give up. You had managed to pierce the bark in a few places. Bits of the gray membrane were curled upward to show the fresh green underside and a hint of bare blonde wood below. But nothing more than that. Your plan to fell the tree had been a total failure, and even the wounds you had inflicted on it would heal in time. Again, the question was, why did you do it? You can't remember your motive, simply the desire to do it, the need to do it. But you suspect it might have been connected to the story about George Washington and the cherry tree, the essential myth of American myth of your childhood, that inexplicable, confounding tale of young George chopping down the tree for no reason, doing it because he wanted to do it, because it struck him as a good idea, which was precisely what you had felt when you decided to cut down your tree, as if every boy, at some point in his childhood, were destined to cut down a tree for the pure pleasure of cutting down a tree. But then, of course, George Washington was the father of his country, of your country. And therefore he stood tall and confessed his misdeed to his own father. I cannot tell a lie. Thus proving himself to be an honest boy, a boy of commendable virtue and moral strength. But you were the father of no country. And therefore you sometimes lied when you were a boy. Lied because, unlike George Washington, you could tell a lie when the situation demanded you tell one, even if you knew that God would eventually punish you for it. But better God, you thought, than your parents. You remember the planes, the supersonic jets roaring across the blue skies of summer, cutting through the firmament at such exalted speeds that they were scarcely visible. A flash of silver glinting briefly in the light, and then, not long after they had vanished over the horizon, the thunderous boom that would follow, resounding for miles in all directions, the great detonation of blasting air that signified the sound barrier had been broken yet again. You and your friends were thunderstruck by the power of those planes, which always arrived without warning, announcing themselves as a furious clamor in the far distance, and within seconds they were directly overhead. In whatever game you and your friends might have been playing at that moment, you all stopped in mid-gesture to look up, to watch, to wait, as those howling machines sped past you. It was the era of aviation miracles, of ever faster and faster, of ever higher and higher, of planes without torsos, planes that looked more like exotic fish than birds, and so prominent were those post-war flying machines in the imaginations of America's children that trading cards of the new planes were widely distributed, much like baseball cards or football cards, and packages of 5 or 6 with a slab of pink bubblegum inside. And on the front of each card there was a photograph of a plane instead of a ball player, with information about that plane printed on the back. You and your friends collected these cards, You were 5 and 6 years old and obsessed with the planes, dazzled by the planes, and you can remember now, suddenly it is all so clear to you, sitting on the floor with your classmates in a school hallway during an air raid drill, which in no way resembled the fire drills you were also subjected to, those impromptu exits into the warmth or the cold, and imagining the school as it burned to the ground in front of your eyes. For an air raid drill kept the children indoors, not in the classroom but the hallway, presumably to protect them against an attack from the air, missiles, rockets, bombs dropped from high-flying communist planes. And it was during that drill that you saw the airplane cards for the first time, sitting on the floor with your back against the wall, silent, with no intention of breaking that silence, for talking was not allowed during these solemn exercises, these useless preparations against possible death and destruction. But one of the boys had a pack of those airplane cards with him that morning, and he was showing them to the other boys, surreptitiously passing them down the line of silent, seated bodies. And when your turn came to hold one of the cards in your hand, you were astonished by the design of the plane, its strangeness and unexpected beauty. All wing, all flight, a metal beast born in the Empyrean, in a realm of pure, everlasting fire. And not once did you consider that the air raid drill you were taking part in was supposed to teach you how to protect yourself from an attack by just such a plane. That is, a plane similar to the one on the card that had been built by your country's enemies. No fear. You never worried that bombs or rockets would fall on you. And if you welcomed the alarms that signaled the start of air raid drills, it was only because they allowed you to leave the classroom for a few minutes and escape the drudgery of whatever lesson you were being taught. In 1952, the year you turned 5, which included the summer of Lenny, the beginning of your formal education, and the Eisenhower-Stevenson campaign, a polio epidemic broke out across America, striking 57,626 people, most of them children, killing 3,300, and permanently crippling untold numbers of others. That was fear, not bombs or a nuclear attack, but polio. Roaming through the streets of your neighborhood that summer, you often came upon clusters of women talking to one another in doleful whispers, women pushing baby carriages or walking their dogs, women with dread in their eyes, dread in the hushed timbre of their voices, and the talk was always about polio, the invisible scourge that was spreading everywhere, that could invade the body of any man, woman, or child at any moment of the day or night. Worse still, there was the young man dying in the house across the street from where your closest friend lived, a Harvard student whose first name was Franklin, a brilliant person according to your mother, someone destined to accomplish great things in life, and now he was wasting away with cancer, immobilized, doomed. And every time you visited your friend Billy, Billy's mother would instruct you to keep your voices down when you went outdoors, so as not to disturb Franklin. You would look across the street at Franklin's white house, the shades drawn in every window, an eerily silent house where no one seemed to live anymore. And you would imagine the tall and handsome Franklin, whom you had seen several times in the past, stretched out on a white bed in his upstairs bedroom, waiting to die his slow and painful death. For all the fear caused by the polio epidemic, you never knew anyone who contracted the disease. But Franklin eventually died, just as your mother had told you he would. You saw the black cars lined up in front of the house on the day of the funeral. 60 years later, you can still see the black cars and the White House. In your mind, they are still the quintessential emblems of grief. Big jump. By the time you were 7 or 8, you were beginning to catch on. Jews were invisible. They had no part to play in American life, and they never appeared as heroes in books or films or television shows. Gentleman's Agreement notwithstanding, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture the year you were born, there were no cowboys called Bernstein or Schwartz. No private eyes called Greenberg or Cohen, and no presidential candidates whose parents had immigrated from the shtetls of eastern Poland and Russia. True, there were some boxers who had done well in the 30s and 40s. There was the quarterback, Sid Luckman, and the three notables from the land of baseball, Hank Greenberg, Al Rosen, and Sandy Koufax, who broke in with the Dodgers in 1955. But they were such flagrant exceptions to the norm that they qualified as demographic flukes, mere statistical aberrations. Jews could play the violin and the piano. They could sometimes conduct symphony orchestras, but the popular singers and musicians were all Italian or black or hillbillies from the South. Vaudevillians, yes. Funny men, yes. The Marx Brothers, George Burns, but no movie stars, and even when the actors had been born Jewish, they invariably changed their names. George Burns had been Nathan Birnbaum. Emmanuel Goldenberg was transformed into Edward G. Robinson. Isor Danielovich became Kirk Douglas, and Hedvig Kiesler was reborn as Hedy Lamarr. Tepid as Gentleman's Agreement might have been, with its contrived plot and sanctimonious positions, a non-Jewish journalist pretends to be Jewish in order to expose prejudices against the Jews. It is instructive to look at that film now as a snapshot of where Jews stood in American society in 1947. That was the world you entered as an infant, and while it was illogical to assume that the German defeat in 1945 should have, or could have, snuffed out anti-Semitism for good, not much had changed on the home front. College admission quotas for Jews were still in force, clubs and other organizations were still restricted, kike jokes still got the boys laughing at the weekly poker game, and Shylock still reigned as the principal representative of his people. Even in the New Jersey town where you grew up, there were invisible barriers, impediments you were still too young to understand or notice. But when your best friend Billy moved away with his family in 1955, and your other good friend Peter vanished the following year, wrenching departures that both puzzled and saddened you, your mother explained that too many Jews were quitting Newark for the suburbs, that they too wanted their patch of grass, just like everyone else, and therefore the old guard was decamping, running away from this sudden influx of non-Christian homeowners. Did she use the word anti-Semitic? You can't remember, but the implication was nevertheless clear. To be a Jew was to be different from everyone else, to stand apart, to be looked upon as an outsider. And you, who until then had seen yourself as thoroughly American as any Mayflower blue blood, now understood that there were those who felt you didn't belong, that even in the place you called home, you were not fully at home. And here's the last little entry, which is again a big jump in terms of the shape of the book. You were inching toward the end of your childhood. The years between 10 and 12 sent you on a journey no less gargantuan than the one between 8 and 10. But day by day, you never had the sense that you were moving quickly, hurtling forward to the brink of your adolescence. For the years passed slowly then, unlike now, when you have only to blink your eyes to discover that tomorrow is your birthday again. By 11, you were mutating into a creature of the herd, struggling through that grotesque period of prepubescent dislocation when everyone is thrust into the microcosm of a closed society, when gangs and cliques begin to form, when some people are in and some people are out, when the word popular becomes a synonym for desire, when the childhood wars between girls and boys come to an end and fascination with the opposite sex begins, a period of extreme self-consciousness, when you are constantly looking at yourself from the outside, wondering and often fretting about how others perceive you, which necessarily makes it a time of much tumult and silliness, when the rift between one's inner self and the self one presents to the world is never wider, when soul and body are most drastically at odds. In your own case, you found yourself becoming preoccupied with how you looked, worrying about whether you had the right haircut, the right shoes, the right pants, the right shirts and sweaters, Never in your life have you been so concerned with clothes as you were at 11 and 12, participating in the game of who is in and who is out with a desperate longing to be in, and at the Friday and Saturday night girl-boy parties that began sometime in the 5th grade, you always wanted to look your best for the girls, the young girls who were living through their own upheavals and torments, with their training bras stretched over flat chests or barely swollen nipples, decked out in their party dresses with the stiff crinolines and whooshing silk slips, wearing garter belts and stockings for the first time. And now, so many years later, you remember the pathos of seeing those stockings sag and droop on their scrawny legs as the evening wore on, even if you could also remember breathing in the sense of their perfume as you held them in your arms and danced with them. Rock and roll had suddenly become interesting and exciting to you. Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers were the musicians you liked best, and you started collecting their records so you could listen to them alone in your upstairs bedroom, stacking the little 45s on their fat spindle and blasting up the volume when no one was around. And on days when you had nothing to do after school, we'd rush home and turn on the television to watch American Bandstand, that spectacle of the new rock and roll universe injected daily into the country's living rooms. But it was more than music that attracted you to the show. It was the sight of a room full of teenagers dancing to that music that kept you watching. For that was what you aspired to most now, to become a teenager. And you studied those kids on the screen as a way to learn something about the next impending step of your life. Last year, it had been the Three Stooges. Now it was Dick Clark and his gang of youthful rockers. The era of pimples and braces had begun. Mercifully, those days come only once. I'm going to stop. Thank you.
I want to let you know that Auster Autography is downstairs on the first floor and book selling is right across the way. Thank you again.